Social isolation was associated with about 50% increased risk in dementia. I thought that by the time I reach a certain age, I will have to content myself with old friends, friends of life, of my life. So when I find myself entering and maintaining new relationships of deeper meaning, I do try to nurture them very, very well. Being lonely is not a given when we get old. I think it is something that we can work on by giving ourselves, no matter how old we are. And I think the older we are, the more we have the feeling of the need of being understood and being listened. Hi, this is Louie Montalbo in my podcast named Senior Moments. Remember the first podcast that I made? I explained to you, my dear listeners, why I actually decided to do a podcast. When I began to turn 60 or a senior citizen, I explained to you the context of my life, of having an 11-year-old son, of still being able to work, but also beginning to struggle with the questions and mysteries of being a senior citizen. I realized that perhaps by doing this podcast, I would be able to explore with you, my listeners, the questions that we want to share with each other and perhaps find answers to these questions. During the first podcast I also did an outline of sorts of the topics that we will be covering in my succeeding podcast. For today, I would like to explore a phenomenon that I think plagues many people who are getting old. The whole mystery, the whole experience of isolation and loneliness. So stay with me for the next 15 to 20 minutes. I'd probably like to start off with an article from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention that defined loneliness as the following: the feeling of being alone, regardless of the amount of social contact. Social isolation is a lack of social connections, and social isolation can lead to loneliness in some people, while others can feel lonely without being socially isolated. The article further said that recent studies found out that social isolation significantly increased a person's risk of premature death from all causes, a risk that may rival those of smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. Social isolation was associated with about 50% increased risk in dementia. Poor social relationships was associated with a 29% increased risk of heart disease and 32% increase in stroke, associated with depression, anxiety, and suicide. Clearly, there are physical and mental impact that is associated with loneliness. So this is something that I think is very important to talk about. If you will allow me, there's another article that I would like to read, and this one comes from psychiatrist.com. It says that loneliness in old age is a complex emotion driven by a mismatch of expectations and reality. And it says that it's not just about being alone. Loneliness, apparently, according to this article, is not just about being alone. It cited a framework called social relationships expectations, that there are two factors that lead to people being lonely. One is that they want to be listened to, and second, they want to make a contribution. We will tackle the first point for this podcast and deal with the second one in my next podcast. Perhaps it would help to explain my context right now. As I said in my first podcast, I'm still a single father who is raising an 11-year-old son. I'm also taking care of my mother who's 94 years old. So like many of my generation who are baby boomers, we're caught between two generations, right? We still have elderly parents that we are taking care of, but we're also raising kids. So our perspective of being a senior citizen, of being able to deal with the whole complex issue of loneliness, is something that I think we can discuss from two perspectives. One being the child of an elderly parent taking care of a senior citizen who themselves are grappling with perhaps loneliness, and we ourselves, as we grow older, begin to grapple with our own sense of isolation and loneliness. Let's start with the first point. As I said, my mom is 94 years old. She lives alone in her own house with a companion. She chose this to be her setup, even if in the past we had invited her to live with one of us, her children, but she refused. She said she would rather live by herself. On a regular basis, every Sunday, I try to call her up. After the pandemic lockdown had eased up, we began to go out a little bit more. At every opportunity, I try to bring my son with him because I noticed that there's a particular magic, and we know this, or dynamics that happens between a grandparent and their grandchildren that sometimes our children, us children, are not able to generate. Whenever I fail to call her up, she actually is the one who calls me and reminds me or asks me, why have I not called? I think for many of us, the challenge when we are dealing with our elderly parents is we begin to shift as being their parents. What I notice with my mom, and I think I'm not as successful as I should be with this one, is I tend to talk down on her. I think it is when I realize and stop myself and simply listen to what her complaints are that she begins to become more at ease with what she's doing. So I guess the need, the human need of being listened to, of being understood, does not have a, does not end, no matter how old we are. And I think the older we are, the more we have the feeling of the need of being understood and being listened to, instead of being talked down to. So I think that's a challenge for us who are still taking care of our old parents. Can we be better at listening to them? Can we be better at understanding them, even if sometimes we get impatient with them? Even if sometimes we don't want to listen to them anymore, and we just want them to follow what we want them to do. I think that furthers their sense of isolation, their sense of loneliness. I should do more of that, I must admit, to listen to my mom a bit more. The second is me as becoming to be a senior citizen and as observe my friends. As I said, I'm still lucky because I'm still working. That allows me the opportunity and the platform to be able to deal with people. That allows me to get out of the house, work, and have meaningful conversations with people that I work with in the school that I'm with. I'm also raising my 11-year-old son, as I said, which means that it's a source of meaningful interactions. The conversations that I have with my son allows me to stay connected with him and feel that I am not alone. But I also know friends who have retired who might be struggling with where to find their social connections. Myself, I struggle with it because I'm an introvert. I have a very small circle of friends. I can practically count with my two hands, with my 10 fingers, the number of close friends that I have. As I was saying, I'm an introvert by nature, and I have very, very few friends. I can practically count with my two hands the number of friends that I consider as my close friends. But we all know this. It takes effort to maintain relationships for a lifetime. So what we do is find ways of getting in touch with each other, of touching base, of going out once in a while. And again, we know this. When our friends are real, no matter how long we have not seen each other, the moment we sit down with each other, it's as if no time has lapsed, and we're able to connect with each other in a very meaningful manner. Whether it's over coffee or wine, over nice dinner, we find ourselves talking about things that truly, truly matter to all of us. My own sense is as we become older, as I become older, there's a greater imperative to maintain that relationship with my good friends. It takes effort to maintain the kind of relationships we've had with them when we were much younger. The other thing that I would like to explore is, at our age, is it possible to establish new friendships? Or are we, in a way, doomed to keep the old friends that we have and not have new friends? From my experience, the new friends that I'm able to establish are those that come from work. People I somehow find connections with, people with whom I share similar experiences with. It takes effort to maintain those new relationships and to find ways of connecting with each other. But once in a while, I think from my own experience, there are certain relationships or connections that become more and more meaningful to me. And this is something that surprised me because I thought that by the time I reach a certain age, I will have to content myself with old friends, friends of life, of my life. So when I find myself entering and maintaining new relationships of deeper meaning, I do try to nurture them very, very well. So what's my point? Being lonely is not a given when we get old. I think it is something that we can work on by giving ourselves the opportunity to explore new friends and putting effort for us to be able to maintain the old ones. Many people say that, we are set in our ways when we become older, that we insist on doing the same things over and over again, and we find it difficult. We find it a challenge to keep up with the changes of the world. That's one way of looking at it, I suppose. But I guess it's also possible that even as we age, even as we grow older, we're able to see things with fresh eyes. We're able to explore other ways of doing things, getting out of our comfort zones, no matter how difficult that may be. Of admitting to ourselves that perhaps the old ways of doing things might not be working anymore, and we need to explore new ways of doing things. I think part of the paradigm sometimes is that old people are stubborn, set in their ways. I think it takes a certain level of, humility and openness for us to find ways of doing things. That's true for other parts of our lives, that I'm also thinking that it might also be relevant in making sure that we stay connected to others. As the articles did say, being isolated, being lonely, feeling alone has a deep impact on our physical and mental well-being. So if we want to stay healthy, stay strong, maintaining relationships is something perhaps that we should explore. So I hope what I shared with you is something that you will find helpful. Again, as I said in my first podcast, I do not have all the answers to all the questions. I continue to struggle with them. It's not as if I have not felt lonely over the past few months or past few years. It's not as if I feel myself isolated at times or feel burdened or feel tired. But I guess that the option of not doing anything about it is something that I have chosen not to do. So if you find this podcast helpful for you, please like the podcast, put a thumbs up on the podcast, share with your friends and your colleagues so that other people might hopefully benefit from what you've heard from me. Explore the other social media accounts that we will be sharing below in the conversation box of this podcast. And please watch out for the next episode of my podcast, where we will be exploring the second portion of how to become less alone, less lonely, the whole phenomenon of making a contribution in the world. The whole question of, is asking the sense of purpose something that only the young should grapple with? Or should old people also begin or continue to ask the question, what is the meaning of my life? How can I make a contribution to the world? What is my sense of purpose? And how do I live it out in the remaining years of my life? So thank you very much. This is Louie Montalbo. For our next episode on Senior Moments with Louie Montalbo.
If I get anything wrong right now, who cares? I'm 60 years old. So, I now turning 60. I don't have to be so trapped in all the social norms.
Everything else that I can do, someone else can do. The only thing that no one can do is be a father.
When your son is 21, or like my son is turning 22 now, suddenly they don't need you. And their natural development process is to individuate from you, is to push you away. I've seen this cycle. It's just really like that. In politics, you're up, you're down. He meant politics. But I think he meant about life, that he's seen enough about life to know that what seems so unbearable at this moment can pass.